available on these digital platforms across the world. WION. World is one.
And welcome to this March 1st edition of the WION VOA co-production. I'm your host, Susan Tehrani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin with the latest on the U.S. presidential race, where election authorities say they're confident that they can fend off any security threats to the November presidential vote. In Alexandria, Virginia, VOA's Veronica Balderas Iglesias sat in on a training for election officers, one of the several measures to ensure a free, fair, and transparent vote. Take a listen.
Last month, top U.S. officials told Congress the U.S. presidential election will be fair and secure, thanks to tightening safeguards and increasing cooperation between federal, state, and local authorities.
From cyber threats, from physical threats, from operational risks, and from foreign malign influence. One thing to note that it's the diversity and decentralization of our election infrastructure, because it's managed by state, by 8,800 separate jurisdictions around the country. That heterogeneity gives it resilience.
In the city of Alexandria, Virginia, for example, ballot scanners are not connected to the internet, thus making the process more secure against hacking attempts.
Additionally, we test the scanners prior to every election through a very intense logic and accuracy test to ensure that they are programmed properly.
To ensure a transparent process, the city is training up to 500 election officers for the primaries and November election. They are learning about what the voting requirements are, as well as how to operate the ballot scanners and certify the results of the precinct.
How many people have checked in? How many ballots have gone through the machine? And it's happening all day long, and different people are doing it. We rotate positions. So there's no way that you're going to have an entire team of people coordinated in order to do anything shady at all.
Given the polarized political environment and potential threats, election officer Mark Dyer and others are also learning the escalation techniques.
Maybe once in a blue moon, there'll be someone who is belligerent or, is having a bad day, a voter. But most of the time, it's been a pleasant experience.
Analysts interviewed by VOA also expect that overall, the upcoming presidential election will run smoothly.
There are many, many eyes on our election system, and adversaries don't really like that. They look for soft targets, things that people aren't really looking at. And so I feel that for those reasons, there really won't be much of a security event, if any, around the 2024 elections.
But there is another kind of threat that voters should be aware of, voting advocates say.
There is mis and disinformation being sowed about the voting systems and how things work to undermine trust in our democratic process. I think that is actually a much bigger concern.
American voters are being encouraged to remain vigilant, volunteer as poll workers or observers themselves, and reach out to authorities if they have questions about how the election process works. Veronica Balderas Iglesias, VOA News, Alexandria, Virginia.
Joining us now live is VOA's Jessica Stone. She's joining us from the White House. Jessica, Good to see you. This Tuesday, 16 states will hold primary elections. The day known as Super Tuesday awards the largest number of delegates in a single day. So what will the results tell us about the race?
Well, they'll tell us most likely who's going to win the nomination for the Republican Party, certainly. We already know that Joe Biden, the current sitting president, is likely to win the Democratic primary. But in terms of the Republican primary, as you know, Nikki Haley, the opposition to former President Donald Trump, is still in the race. And this is going to be a big test for her on Tuesday. Super Tuesday awards about a quarter of the delegates needed to win the nomination. You need over 1,200, just over 1,200 delegates to win. And this is likely to be Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador and governor of South Carolina. It's likely to be her last stand. She has just about 24 delegates. Former President Donald Trump has 122. And if he picks up the some 800 that he's likely to pick up on Super Tuesday, winning the majority of the delegates on Tuesday, that, of course, puts him very close within striking distance of that 1,200 figure. So a real test of her mettle. But we will likely see a winner coming out just shortly after Super Tuesday in Donald Trump for the Republican nomination.
Also, Democrats used the Michigan primary to send a strong message to President Biden. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's an interesting development because it is a vulnerability for this president that he's taken the position he has on Israel and Gaza and continuing to support both militarily and funding-wise the Israeli government that is prosecuting that conflict in Gaza. President Biden did win the Democratic primary in the state of Michigan, but 13% of the electorate, around 13%, voted uncommitted, and they were encouraged through a campaign by local Arab American activists to do so, including a group called Listen to Michigan, which has not only young voters, but also a lot of Arab American voters. And this is important because Dearborn, Michigan, which is, of course, the birthplace of Henry Ford, who created the Ford Motor Company, that has more than half of its population are from North Africa and from the Middle East. And so there are strong ties to what's going on, strong emotions about to what's going on in Israel and in Gaza. They were encouraged to vote uncommitted, and they did so. Biden has called, of course, just for a temporary ceasefire for Ramadan, but these groups want him to support a permanent ceasefire. Susan?
All right, great. Thank you so much for that. Jessica, please do stay with me. Although the number of migrant crossings daily into the United States has fallen since December, local communities are still scrambling to provide them with resources. In the Pacific Northwest, a small town church has become a shelter for hundreds of people from Africa and Latin America. From Tukwila, Washington, VOA's Natasha Mozgovaya has our report.
I don't know what you're saying.
Jen Bolerjik is the pastor of Riverton Park United Methodist Church here in Tukwila, a suburb of Seattle. In the past year, the church has helped about 1,000 migrants find shelter, food, and clothing.
Somehow this place has been listed across the country and at the border that this is the place to go. And yet I'm kind of embarrassed when they get here and we have to say, no, you got to sleep in a wet, soggy tent.
Early on, the church's open door for the most vulnerable was met with local donations and support from the city. But Bolerjik says those limited resources are now being stretched by as many as 25 new asylum seekers per week.
It's wall-to-wall mattresses at night with people sleeping, and all of their possessions are lining the edges of the room. It's not the best system, but it's the best we can do.
Jeremiah Lefaux says he left Angola with his wife and children in December 2022.
When I arrived here in the United States, I didn't have a place to go. They protected me, and then I was given food and drink, and I felt safe.
Unlike refugees who may receive assistance through resettlement programs, asylum seekers may find themselves homeless with no means to support themselves until their work permit application is approved. Bolerjik says that in the past year, only one person seeking shelter at her church has gotten their work permit.
They don't have a proper ID because all they have are their asylum papers coming across the border. And so some shelters turn them away for that. There are still a lot of people sleeping out there on the street. of course, joining the other 14,000 that we have sleeping on our streets.
When temperatures dropped below freezing here, donations and funding from local and state agencies moved hundreds of asylum seekers from tents to hotels. State Representative Mia Gregerson is working toward a more coordinated response with a bill that aims to empower the local Office of Refugee and Immigrant Assistance.
Tukwila is a tiny little city. I think they're really rolling their sleeves up well and really making a go of that. But there is a lot of uncertainty. What are we going to do when the funds run out? The idea is that the office is able to be nimble and be able to utilize resources quickly to not only put them into the system to get them legal advice that's correct and factual and quick, to get them the education resources, the transportation needs, and housing vouchers.
Governor Jay Inslee is asking lawmakers for more than $8 million in additional funding in his latest state budget to support people who do not qualify for federal refugee resettlement services. Meanwhile, the Biden administration pushing for measures to reduce the number of asylum seekers who can enter the U.S. Natasha Mozgovaya, VOA News, Tukwila, Washington.
Okay, VOA's Jessica Stone is back with us now. Jessica, President Biden and former President Donald Trump both went to the Mexico-Texas border on Thursday, with immigration and border security, of course, being a major issue in U.S. politics. How did Thursday's visit play into the presidential race?
Well, it's a key issue, as you mentioned, and we really had that split screen moment between President Biden and former President Trump in different parts of the state. Interesting to note that former President Trump chose to go to a real hot spot with immigration, where a majority of the migrant crossings are happening, with historic numbers. And President Biden chose to go to Brownsville, Texas, a much quieter part where they're not seeing as many crossings. But this was a battle of their ideas on immigration, with President Trump raising again the specter that he would re-implement, if elected, many of the policies that he had done prior, and increase building a border wall. Biden is really vulnerable on this issue as well because of how many people we're seeing. We're seeing historic numbers over the border. He's also under fire from fellow Democrats, primarily Democratic mayors across the country. New York City Mayor Eric Adams saying that we really need the White House to work harder to prevent these migrants from coming into the country, even those claiming asylum. New York City itself has absorbed 180,000 migrants just since the spring of 2022. There isn't enough space for them to be housed and fed, etc. Another city, Denver, in the middle of the country, in Denver, Colorado, they have actually had to lay off workers in the Parks Department because of the resources they need to put towards accommodating the influx of migrants into that city. So on the campaign trail, we have seen Biden send a tougher message on immigration. He is now acknowledging that the border situation is an emergency and that it is not secure. He is also reminding the public that Republicans failed to pass, under President Trump's direction, a tougher border security measure just a few weeks ago. And he says, look, I will work with you, former President Trump and Republicans, to pass that. I support that. You need to come to the table, he says, and make sure that this gets done. Susan?
Jessica, today is the first of two deadlines for Congress to pass funding measures to keep the U.S. government open. Late on Wednesday, we learned that leaders on Capitol Hill reached a deal on 6 spending bills. Can you talk about that? What's in it? And will it address emergency spending for Ukraine, Taiwan, and the Middle East?
Yeah, so that's probably the biggest question that people outside the United States are wondering is, will this current spending situation, the package of bills that's before Congress, have anything to do, any aid going to the international community? And the answer is no, it will not. What this bill does is it gives, and it was passed yesterday, it gives Congress more time to negotiate on a whole host of spending issues. There's a fundamental conflict between about a dozen House conservatives who want offsets for every amount of spending that goes into these bills. And what would have happened today had this not been passed and them giving themselves more time to negotiate is we would have had a partial government shutdown for critical departments like transportation. So that means the FAA, all of our airports would have been impacted. The Veterans Department, Housing and Urban Development, and the Department of Agriculture, all of those now expected to be funded when the president signs this temporary extension, and then the Congress expected to vote on the final package on Wednesday. But that's just the first tranche of spending. Then there's going to be another similar process, and where this is going to essentially drag out into March. We don't know where in that we will see some efforts to address these critical funding needs in Ukraine and Taiwan and in the Middle East, but that is still part of the conversation. But House Speaker Mike Johnson, who is very much beholden to those dozen conservatives, because that's the reason he is in the leadership right now, he has said time and time again, we are not going to address those foreign aid needs until we fund the U.S. government. That now looking like it's going to drag on through March into the Easter holiday and the Easter recess. Susan?
Wow. Great. Thank you so much for all of those updates. VOA's Jessica Stone joining us from the White House. Jessica, have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Ignoring the widespread fear of arrest, hundreds of people gathered for the funeral of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny in Moscow amid heavy security arrangements. Many came from faraway areas to the southeastern Moscow suburb to bid farewell to Putin's fiercest critic. Amid chants of Navalny, his coffin was carried out of a black hearse outside the Church of the Icon of the Mother of God Soothe My Sorrows in Moscow's Mariano neighborhood. People queued up outside the church in the neighborhood where Navalny used to live. His mother was expected to attend the funeral while his widowed wife, Yulia, was not in Russia. It was unclear who else had been allowed into the church for the service. Navalny was buried at the Boris-Ovoksky Cemetery. His supporters say that authorities have been blocking their plans to hold a bigger service memorial service.
I came here to Moscow for Alexi's funeral to give the last honors. It is important to me. For many people, it's important. That is why I did not see any options but to come for the funeral.
The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov remarked that he had nothing to say about Navalny's family, while adding that any unsanctioned gathering in his support would be a violation of the law. Navalny died on February 16th in an Arctic penal colony where he was serving a 30-year sentence. His family has accused Moscow of having a role to play in his death, a charge which the Kremlin has outright denied. Tensions are high as authorities have outlawed Navalny's movement as being extremists. Rights groups had advised those attending the ceremony to take their passports and small bottles of water with them. Attendees were also told to write down the details of lawyers in case they are detained. Texas. Texas is witnessing the biggest wildfire it has ever seen. The desert state's largest blaze, called the Smokehouse Creek Fire, scorched more than 1 million acres of grassland and timber and destroyed homes and small towns that dot the Panhandle region. Fire crew fight to continue